This is the Secular Nation Podcast, an official production of the Atheist Alliance of America, bringing you breaking news and stories about the intersection of the atheist free thought movement and government action. Here are your hosts, Justin Clark and Jeremy Casey. Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Secular Nation. My name is Justin Clark. I'm here with my co-host, Jeremy. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm Jeremy Casey. It's a better time than ever to rage.
I think so. This is going to be the first episode of this sort of new version of Secular Nation. So we'll give you a quick little bio of who we are. I am the admin of Philosophical Atheism on Facebook. We also have a website, philosophicalatheism.com. I'm also the host of An Army of Principles, the podcast, which you probably either checked out on SoundCloud or YouTube or on iTunes. I am a public historian. I have been a public historian for 2 years. And I've been in the atheist free thought movement for about 7 years and an atheist for about that same time. And my background is in history and political science. So I have what I hope to think is a fairly decent grasp of the issues facing our country, particularly in the separation of religion and government. So, how about you, Jeremy?
Well, I am a longtime debater from high school. Grew up in the church, so I have insider knowledge of kind of the culture and the way it's changed in the last 20 years. Or, kind of just made their plans more apparent and political. But so I kind of broke out of all of that. And that was right around the time that me and you became friends. So, we kind of stayed in touch. I've been on An Army of Principles talking about the Democratic and Republican primaries. So
if you want to get a little more of a flavor of that, I think it's episodes like 7 and 8, so go check those out.
Yep, there you go. And then I have a background in physics. Did not finish out my degree. We'll hopefully do that here soon. I've been in the trenches of the mathematics of science, and there's clearly, more there than the religious right fundamentals, or people who don't want to take the time to learn it would admit. So my eyes have been opened, and I'm happy to be on this podcast with a free thought activist like Justin here.
Awesome. So tonight's episode is basically going to be some stories about what I like to call the trumpening. So as we all know, most of us who know, if you survived it, the president-elect Donald Trump has now been working on his transition team. And we're going to talk about some of his cabinet, some of the choices that he's made. And particularly, we're going to talk a little bit about his vice president-elect, Mike Pence, who is the governor of our state. So we sort of have a firsthand sort of experience with Mike Pence. So the first story we're going to be talking about tonight is from thehill.com, and it's by Dan Arel, who you probably are fairly familiar with. He does the Danthropology podcast and blog, and very big in the free thought movement. And he wrote this article called "The Biggest Victim Under a President Trump is Freedom of Religion." So to quote the piece here, he sort of talks about minority groups across the country fear the impact such a cabinet, made up of science denialists, white nationalists, and Christian extremists, will have on their communities. Another important impact this administration will potentially have is on religious freedom, as Trump and his forming cabinet have long had great disdain for the First Amendment. And the piece sort of goes on to describe how Trump, and particularly his vice president Mike Pence, have been very openly against women's reproductive health, the LGBTQ community, and in particular, Trump has been very vocal about the Johnson Amendment, which is an amendment that was passed in the mid-1950s by then Senator Lyndon Johnson. And what that particular amendment does is it makes sure that churches and religious nonprofits, and nonprofits in general, don't politic from the pulpit or from their organization. And a special rider was added to that law years later that says you can't also endorse particular candidates. And that's been the standard law for years and years and years. And Trump wants to do away with that. And what that would do is it would essentially make churches and religious nonprofits into political action committees, but make them sort of super PACs where you could sort of put dark money into them and they can kind of do whatever they want. And this is sort of an extremely dangerous precedent, particularly if for us secular Americans, we want to keep a separation of church and state, and particularly try to keep money out of politics where it sort of doesn't belong.
Well, I mean, the Johnson Amendment scared the shit out of me. I mean, Trump said, and I quote, "An amendment pushed by Lyndon Johnson many years ago threatens religious institutions with the loss of tax-exempt status if they openly advocate their political views. Their voice has been taken away." There is no point in my life where I've ever gotten the sense that the Christians' voices have been taken away.
Oh, absolutely.
They're the loudest voice in the room constantly.
Absolutely. And if you go back to Breitbart.com, who is a big voice in this election, particularly with the selection of Steve Bannon as his chief advisor, Breitbart.com has called the Johnson Amendment the Christian gag rule. And so, I mean, this is one of those things where for us as secularists, I mean, this is seriously dangerous stuff, because then churches can sort of act as political organizations, and they get to do so with a nonprofit status, which means that us as Americans, we are all sort of subsidizing them because they're not paying taxes, which means that we're sort of, think of it this way, you're sort of writing a check that's then going to that organization to perpetuate their own ideology. That wouldn't be great. I mean, and the thing that they often don't think about is that just because you can do it doesn't mean that you're going to be the only ones that are going to be allowed to do it. So, So imagine a different religion that probably they don't like Islam. Islam, an Islamic church or organization could do the exact same thing. And you can imagine, or Satanists could do the same thing.
Or just sects they don't agree with.
Absolutely.
Like the my church that I grew up in was originally a part of the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church of the USA. But then the PCUSA got a little bit too open to, women serving as ministers, and I guess they questioned the divinity of the Trinity. I didn't get too much into those arguments, but then they went to the Evangelical Presbytery of the US, and it's just they don't agree with those people. And they're all just going to be shoving money at the least common denominator, which is Republicans.
Absolutely.
So they're not even going to be fighting for their beliefs as a church. They're just going to be funneling it into an existing system that's broken.
And so with that in mind, you also have to think about Mike Pence as his vice president. Because a lot of people have said, yeah, well, don't worry about LGBTQ rights being threatened under Trump, because Trump has really sort of not said that much against them, and he even said something nice about them in his convention speech. That's fine, but I'm all about sort of that phrase in the Bible, actually, judge ye by your fruits, right? So judge people by their actions. And choosing Mike Pence as a vice president is really dangerous. In particular, Mike Pence believes in gay conversion therapy. He voted against an LGBTQ non-discrimination act, and he has been pretty virulent about his feelings on the gay community. And from another article we're going to be talking about here in a minute, he had like a 7% rating from the ACLU.
Oh, yeah.
So...
and we've seen it firsthand in the state of Indiana. It's
for sure.
I mean, it's an assault on any secular or women's rights organization since day one. He's passed law. He's tried to pass laws to make it, which is mentioned in the next article we'll talk about, to make it illegal, or you have to bury a fetus, no matter if it's a miscarriage or an abortion. You have to pay for a burial to respect the dignity of its life. Respects 14th Amendment protections for a fetus, which is, I don't care what your moral arguments on it are at all. In the world we live in, safe abortions are vital so that we can move to a point where maybe abortions aren't necessary because we have proper,
absolutely
proper education.
Exactly, same thing.
Mike Pence also doesn't believe condoms are effective.
Yeah,
that the only safe sex is no sex. This is in the next article, but that lists it out, man.
It is pretty terrifying. And so the main story we're really going to be talking tonight is from theintercept.com. It's by Jeremy Scahill. And his article that he wrote is called "Mike Pence Will Be the Most Powerful Christian Supremacist in U.S. History." And I think this is right. One thing I remember recently was I think a couple days or a week before the election, Michael Moore was on MSNBC, and he said something along the lines of, the cultural wars, they're essentially dead. The Christian right's not going to have its power. And he was dead. He was greatly, greatly wrong. He was incredibly wrong. One of the things that Scahill's reporting does is it gives us a sense of who Mike Pence is connected to. And in particular, he's connected to a man named Erik Prince. And Erik Prince is the founder of Blackwater, which was this paramilitary private security firm. And it was deeply enmeshed with sort of the failures of the war in Iraq. There were many soldiers who were members of Blackwater, who were sort of, hired soldiers, who led to the deaths of scores of Iraqis, some of which went to prison for multi-year sentences, and it has been a wave of controversy over the last 10 years. And Erik Prince gave $100,000 to Donald Trump's campaign.
And his mother Elsa gave $50,000.
Yeah, and these people are sort of far-right evangelicals who believe in sort of instituting a Christian kingdom here on earth. And Donald Trump, who I don't strike as being that religious, but he's an opportunist and he's kind of smart to know who to sort of surround himself with, knows that he can sort of gain a certain level of credibility within the Christian right if he does these certain things. And so Prince is also heavily connected to Mike Pence and has given money to Pence's campaign. But we're going to talk a little bit also about some of the things that the piece doesn't talk about, because the piece does not bring up RFRA.
Okay, yep. Does not bring up vital things that he actually did while governing. It kind of just talks about his money connections.
Yeah, let's talk. Why don't you talk a little bit about what he's done as governor?
Well, Mike Pence came in. He was a radio personality before.
Yeah.
I never heard him on the radio, but he came in as governor, beating John Gregg in 2012, unfortunately. And
before that, he was a congressman for 12 years.
Okay, yep. And he mainly just wanted to play the Christian playbook. So all those laws that were being written about how you can check off your state for your anti-abortion, you're approving your anti-gay agenda, you're proving you're one of God's soldiers. He ticked off every one in succession. RFRA, we had there was a convention that was pulled. I always forget, but it was a major convention that was pulled out of Indianapolis. There were many companies pulling out, and like Indianapolis is, in a unique position to kind of come out of the economic recovery in a big way. But it just seemed like every single policy was just a way to impose a Christian doctrine on Indiana businesses, on Indiana individuals.
For sure. And the other thing I always think about is the Indiana version of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And for those of you who don't know, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was originally a federal law that was passed in the early 90s. What it was sort of spurned by a Supreme Court decision where a Native American had wanted to use peyote in a religious ritual, and they weren't allowed to, and they were arrested for it, and it went to a court of appeals and eventually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against the Native American. And people thought this was so sort of abhorrent that an individual's liberty to practice their religion was violated by the state, that both Democrats and Republicans passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was one of the first laws that Bill Clinton signed into law in, I think, 1993. And it was overwhelmingly supported. And at the time, it wasn't seen as being that controversial because the law was supposed to be about saving the liberties, or sort of protecting the liberties of individual people versus the state. So if the state was sort of violating a person's rights, then that person could sort of sue under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and have their religious liberty, their individual religious liberty protected. This all goes out the window with the 2014 Hobby Lobby decision, which was about contraceptive coverage. Hobby Lobby sued the federal government over the contraceptive mandate in the Affordable Care Act, and they won. And what that meant was it greatly expanded the power of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So now, instead of it being just about individuals versus individuals protecting their rights from the government, it's about organizations and corporations can now have a redress of grievances under this law. So it's sort of a corporations are people too law, where corporations can now sue the federal government or state governments for any violations of their quote-unquote deeply held religious beliefs, which is the language that is used in the majority opinion by Samuel Alito back in 2014. This all comes to a head the year after, in the spring of 2015, when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana was passed. And basically what it was a turn the gays away bill. And so religious nonprofits who had a nonprofit status had a right to openly discriminate against people of the LGBTQ community who did not fit their test of deeply held religious beliefs, even though they were nonprofits. And the other thing that's a huge problem with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is it sort of allowed corporations to get all kinds of special favors under the guise of deeply held religious beliefs. And it was just a way for corporations and for businesses to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. And there were many companies, as you mentioned, that were against this. So you had a company like Salesforce decided not to open up a new branch. You had Angie's List that decided not to open up a thing. The thing you were thinking about earlier was I think it was Indiana PopCon, one of the big pop culture conventions, decided that it might pull out. Well, this created a big brouhaha. The General Assembly came back. They passed what they called the fix, where it was sort of, we're not trying to discriminate against people. And then the city of Indianapolis would eventually pass its own LGBTQ civil rights protection laws. And cities all over the state have done this. Kokomo, where I live, has. Carmel, Bloomington has. But the state does not have a full-wide LGBT protections. So that just is to give you guys some context. Because
that was months of his. I mean, that was a huge issue for at least 2 to 3 months.
And it killed his credibility as a governor.
Killed his credibility, and it was basically, let's put more laws on the books that we have to fix with other laws for rights that basically should have been there. You know, you could just write one thing in the Civil Rights, our state Civil Rights Act, to put the protections in there, and then still have, constitutionally guaranteed right for individual religious freedom.
Absolutely.
But, I mean, he's just sitting there trying to get Christian bakers to deny cakes to gay weddings, which seems like a lost monetary potential for no reason. I don't understand that.
The issue you have with the sort of the gay wedding cakes or whatever is that...
Or pizzas.
They
can't get pizzas for gay weddings. Like, what's that about? All right.
I know that President Obama made a joke that year that was like, Joe and I are so close, we might not be able to get pizza in Indiana or something like that. Me and Joe Biden. And so what happened with this law was that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the federal civil rights laws, essentially say that a business like a bakery is what you would call a place of public accommodation, right? And the reason why it's sort of defined that way is because of Jim Crow, and Jim Crow in the South, where African Americans, and in the North as well, but African Americans who were turned away from service at like a Woolworth's diner or a lunch counter, and they weren't allowed to eat, and they weren't allowed to ride the bus, they weren't allowed to do certain things, and they said, we're not putting up with this because it's a violation of our civil rights, and it was. And so places of public accommodation say you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, creed, religion, whatever. Well, the problem is that these laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, does not have a place within it to protect sexual orientation or gender identity. And so I think we as secularists, I think we would argue that we need those protections because the rights of all citizens are more important in sort of a multifaceted society than sort of individual religious beliefs. And so in my opinion, by and large, I think that the society's needs circumvent the importance of a person's individual religious liberty, because even if you protect society's rights, you're not really violating a person's individual liberty at all. So that's the key here. And so, and he has been so virulently anti-abortion.
He's put so much energy into it, too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like this is the focus of his entire governing strategy is to implement these Christian standards.
Absolutely.
And then when you couple this with the Johnson Amendment talk from the original article, it just spells disaster and doom for any kind of freedoms as a business. Christians already make up such a great proportion of the society, already own so much of the property, wealth, and distribution of goods and services, that to allow a mass just retraction of those services from a large portion of it based on religious stuff is, that seems to be the ultimate goal for Mike Pence.
Absolutely, which is why Scahill calls him a Christian dominionist, Christian supremacist.
Waging Christian jihad. I was not aware of these terms before. I love them. Like Christian supremacy, totally on point. Christian jihad, the original interpretation of the word jihad, correct.
I love them. I think they're absolutely right. And as Jeff Daniels' character in the Newsroom, he would have called them the American Taliban. And so the one thing you think...
And their extremist proxies are rising up right now doing Nazi salutes in convention halls.
There are so many bad cabinet choices.
Oh, yeah.
There have been so many bad ones, like sort of the murmurings that Ben Carson might be, might be his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, even though he's a neurosurgeon and has no experience in either
Didn't he
in
admit
public
that?
service. He did.
Yeah,
he turned down originally being Secretary of Education, saying, I do not have the experience.
But you ran for president.
But you ran for president. You know what I
my
mean?
gosh.
And then, but you're okay with taking housing and urban development, even though you've never had a government position and you have actually no experience in architecture or urban planning or social organization. You're just a guy who's really good at fixing brains. Like, but yeah,
I
this
haven't
is
looked
so
at his
messed up.
record. People tell me that. I'm just taking that on faith right now. So I'm just going to assume that he's not that great.
I personally think he's a savant. Like, if anything, he's just a savant. But to sort of wrap up about Mike Pence, this is a guy who has said that Roe v. Wade should be in the ash heap of history. This is a guy who tried to get a law passed in Indiana that would have miscarriages or abortions have to have a burial or cremation services. This is a guy who shut down the needle exchange program in the state, which led to a massive HIV outbreak in the southeast part of the state, because Indiana as a state has been racked by the opioid addiction, by the opioid crisis and heroin. And so
wouldn't he not authorize HIV funding unless we had tests to make sure that we taught gay people not to be gay so they don't spread HIV?
Yeah.
And that's what killed it for him?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Goodness gracious. The other thing he did was
condoms don't work. Condoms don't work.
Condoms don't work. The other thing he did was, as a state that Scahill didn't talk about in his piece, was he turned down $500 million of early education money. It was just the money that was going to come back to the state for early childhood education. He said no. The other thing he tried to do, and this happened while I was at the State House, was he tried to institute essentially a state-run news service called Just In, which would be a state-run news service that would release press releases from the governor's office, but would sort of display them as being news articles.
Oh, okay. So sponsored content for the government,
yeah.
Okay.
So for about a week or two back in the fall of 2014, if you typed in state-run news service on Google, you got China, Russia, Indiana. It was
wow.
I was really embarrassed.
Well, okay. So we got our own little Russian Times. I wonder what he'll do the national thing.
Goodness gracious.
I mean, there's some good reporting coming out of Russian Times, but there's definitely some Russian propaganda coming out of there. So.
There's definitely some Russian propaganda.
And you just gotta, but this whole fake news thing, guys, just be logical. Just be rational. Just research what you're sharing, and if you see false news, attempt to, in a non-combative way, point out to people that that's completely false.
Yeah.
Because we can't, we can have the tools, private organizations censoring out content, but I don't trust any of those algorithms. None of them ever worked. It's really about just reading your shit. Anyway, I just wanted to do that public service announcement.
No, please do. As somebody who's sort of an information specialist.
That's right. I do work in the tech field, and that's another scary thing about Pence. He actively does not believe that we should have warrants for any sort of domestic surveillance. He actively wants to protect telecom companies who do engage in warrantless wiretapping without protecting their consumers' information at all.
He's absolutely garbage on environmental issues.
Global warming is a myth.
Yeah.
There, I said it. That's a quote from him. Global warming is a myth. Oh, you're so brave, Mike Pence.
Apparently, he's backed off of that a little bit. But the thing about Mike Pence is people always talk about Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker as being a Koch governor, meaning that he's sort of funded by the Koch brothers, those big petroleum industrial magnates. Pence is also a Koch governor.
Oh, yeah. He is an antithesis of what they wanted to get out of government, which was corruption. Money. I mean, the people who said they were voting for Trump for change, Trump's son said, we're just going to let Mike Pence run domestic and international policy, and then Trump is going to focus on making America great again. So,
right?
Even if Trump doesn't get impeached, Mike Pence has been running it the entire time.
Exactly.
And him and Bannon. I think Bannon's getting more leeway than even Pence would like, but it seems to me that those two are the top of this ticket, and those are the most dangerous people in politics right now.
And from what I've read from investigative reporter David K. Johnston, I mean, his book, The Making of Donald Trump, is, I think, essential reading for trying to understand who Donald Trump is. He's reported, and so is his co-author of The Art of the Deal, Peter Schwartz, said, the guy has no attention span. He likely has ADD or ADHD. So obviously he's going to be delegating all the time to people. I mean, we haven't seen this level of delegation probably since the Reagan years.
And it's going to be delegation when I mean, presidents are supposed to delegate, but he is delegating his delegation.
Yes, and that's
Like,
the
that's
huge
the level.
problem.
That's the meta level of this. It's terrible. Anyway.
So, in sort of an interesting point, so Eric Prince, we've talked about Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater. His sister is probably going to be the next Secretary of Education. I think her name is Betsy DeVos or Devos.
I'm going to call her Devo. Like that band.
Like the band.
Yep.
This is a piece from Business Insider by Michelle Mark. Meet Betsy DeVos, the polarizing charter school advocate Trump has tapped as education secretary. Quote, President-elect Donald Trump on Wednesday tapped Michigan billionaire and charter school advocate Betsy DeVos as his choice for education secretary, a move that has prompted a flurry of praise and backlash from either political side throughout the week. So this is a woman who has never gone to public schools. Her children have never gone to public schools. She has never worked in a public school. She's never been an administrator in a school, period. So she's just sort of an advocate for private schools and for charter schools. And I can imagine our Secular Nation listeners are pretty familiar with charter schools and with vouchers. She's a big proponent of voucher programs. And these are hugely, hugely unconstitutional and against the separation of church and state, separation of religion and government. David Silverman, the president of American Atheists, released an absolutely scathing press release about her. He said, quote, American Atheists has grave concerns about the direction of education policy under the Trump administration. In particular, Mr. Trump's support for vouchers, a scheme which allows taxpayer dollars to be directed to religious schools, is cause for alarm. The nomination of Betsy DeVos to implement Mr. Trump's proposal to spend $20 billion in federal taxpayer dollars and more than $100 billion of state education funding on religious education makes it clear that American atheists and other advocates will need to remain vigilant and do everything in our power to fight any attempt to force the American public to subsidize religious dogma. I think this was the story even more than this is the story that unbelievably pissed me off because I think that charter schools are unbelievably unconstitutional. I don't think if they are private religious or parochial schools, because that's our money as public taxpayers going towards a school that has a very specific religious message and a very specific religious education.
Most of the time. There's some classical ones, but those can easily be co-opted.
Absolutely.
Like each administration can say we're going to add in this level of religious teaching, or we're going to put more lip service over to this one, and we're just footing the bill for them to spout nonsense.
It's craziness. I mean, one of the problems too is that they're also very, very unregulated. So you might have a science class where they may actually teach real science, meaning evolution, natural selection, physics. They might actually teach real science, but they oftentimes get more religious instruction than they do actual education in the math, reading, sciences, humanities, and so. Because of that, we're subsidizing people to indoctrinate their kids, or to have their kids be indoctrinated,
which they can do at home.
Yep,
which they can do at fucking home.
And if you want to send your kid to a private school, then pony up, because I, as a taxpayer, don't feel like I am responsible for having to send your kid to a private religious school. I believe very firmly in having a comprehensive public school system, a public school system that is well funded with good teachers, that teaches good education, that has good standards, and I am absolutely against this type of religious encroachment on public education.
I mean, this is the extension of what they've been trying to do since the 70s and 80s, though. This is they figured out that they could not infect the public schools enough with creationism and their teaching. Yep. And so they've moved in the past probably 15 years to this voucher system.
Oh, for sure.
To subsidize schools that have no need to respond to any kind of organization or agency about what they're teaching the children.
I completely agree with you.
So, I mean, it's all about the plans, okay? You can see this. It's been coming from the 60s and 70s, and it's a constant, they're waging war on the Constitution.
And Trump being the political opportunist he is, who I don't honestly think he has any core principles at all, is willing to go along with this because he knows that these people are very powerful and influential movers and shakers in the political arena.
This is the foot in the door for the Christian right to wage jihad through private contracting business. Eric Prince is a part of Blackwater, is a private contractor. He doesn't want no bid, he wants to take off regulations of no bid contracting, which just allows them to have basically what state their price. Is that how that
Yeah,
works?
yeah.
So these, I mean, like, I feel like Pence probably sees these as soldiers of God, sent from corporate capitalist God, God sanctioned capitalism in America is what he thinks. It needs to fight through these paid soldiers so that they can wage, jihad against the Muslims because we can't do it directly.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, to just sort of bring it back real quick about Betsy DeVos, because I agree with you on all of that, but I would also argue that we as secularists, as atheists, the nuns, if you will, N-O-N-E-S, atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, whatever you want to call yourself, we're one of the largest demographics in the country, and yet we only accounted, in the 2012 election, we only accounted for 12% of the vote. If we voted our true numbers, if we voted 24% or 20%, Hillary Clinton would have been president.
Which also the other parts of the culture do not vote at 100%. So if we were to vote our entire block, it would be greater than the 24% that we actually
Exactly.
make in proportion.
It would be a larger
it could be 40 to 50% of the vote.
I totally agree. It could be a larger demographic than African Americans. It'd be a larger demographic than the Jewish population in the United States. And here's the kicker: it could be a voting bloc that could either rival or beat evangelicals.
Oh, it could easily beat them.
And so this is what I'm saying. This is my advice to you: get registered to vote, stay informed on the issues, and most importantly, just be a critical thinker. Just think about the issues that are in front of you. Seriously think about the pros and cons of policies and make up your own mind, because I think it's very important for people to be open-minded about things. Do I want to give Trump a chance? Yeah, I kind of do, because I kind of like the country I live in.
All right.
But
right.
there's a part of me that really feels like we as secularists, like we've okay, he's won, we've given him a chance. Let's see what he can do. And he has already, in my opinion, grossly disappointed us. I really do.
I forget who said it, but I think it was said that we give him a chance, but don't give him an inch. So you're going to be ready to fight too, is what I'm saying there.
I agree.
Everybody needs to be ready to fight this shit.
We do, and that's why we're vigilant, and that's why we are going to keep coming back and sharing with you more of the outrageousness that is the religious right's war on reason and secularism and freedom. This has been Justin Clark.
And this has been Jeremy Casey.
And this has been Secular Nation.